If getting lost and then turning up in weird places was an Olympic event, then today's subjects would win the gold. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Line. On January 20th, 1992, Garrett Frostman pulled into the parking lot at the Hoh River Trailhead in Olympic National Park, where he expected to find his friend and fellow University of Stuttgart exchange student Stefan Bissert. Instead, Garrett found himself waiting in the parking lot for hours, the sun inching closer and closer to the horizon. Darkness began to creep over the valley, but there was still no sign of Stefan coming down the trail. Aware that his friend didn't have any overnight camping equipment, Garrett decided to stay in the lot and wait, hoping that Stefan had simply overestimated his ability to make the hike before nightfall, and that he would eventually turn up sometime late in the night, tired and cold, but very much alive. But Stefan never showed. By morning, Frostman was becoming nervous, but not yet panicked. He and Bissert had started the previous day hiking together on the Solduck Trail, but around 10:30 a.m. they split off to go their own ways upon reaching Deer Lake, just over 3 miles south of the trailhead. Now, according to the Kitsap Sun, once they reached Deer Lake, Bissert decided that he wanted to attempt a much longer hike, which would take him from their position to the Hoh River Trailhead, which was another 20 miles down the trail. Frostman, for his part, would return to the Solduck Trailhead and then drive down to pick Bissert up at the end of his trail. It was possible that Stefan had decided he couldn't make that hike with what daylight remained, and instead turned back for their starting point, but when Frostman returned to the Solduck parking lot around noon and found no sign of Stefan, he alerted the park rangers about his failure to appear. The rangers began their search effort almost immediately, with their primary concern being the weather. According to Frostman, Bissert wasn't carrying any overnight gear, and to make matters worse, he was really only dressed for a short day hike. He had no hat, gloves, or long underwear, and had gone out that day wearing only his blue jeans, his base layer, his sweater, and a windbreaker. The only food he'd brought along were 2 bananas and 2 oranges, and all he had in the way of survival equipment was a fire starting kit, which of course would be of limited use in snowy mountain conditions. And the conditions were indeed snowy. Over that first night, up to a foot of snow had fallen in some places along the trail, and particularly where it followed the ridgeline from Deer Lake to Hoh Lake for some 5 miles before descending into the Hoh River Valley. The hope was that Bissert, with 7 hours of daylight to go at the point of separation, had at least made it beyond the ridgeline, and then the best case scenario would be if he'd reached the valley floor over 4,000 feet below. There, it would be anywhere from 12 to 20 degrees warmer, with dense tree cover and even a number of campgrounds. Survival in those circumstances wouldn't be guaranteed, but if he made it down, it would certainly have been a more favorable situation. But unfortunately, by the end of the first day of searches on Tuesday the 21st, it was becoming clear that Stefan might not be in the valley, and if he was, he certainly wasn't on any of the trails. The rangers were going to need help. That help arrived at 3:30 a.m. on Wednesday the 22nd, when members of Olympic Mountain Rescue arrived to begin searching both on the ground and from the air. The rangers believed that Stefan had most likely gotten lost along the High Divide due to the deep January snow cover, so the primary search areas would be the Bogachiel and Hoh River drainages to the west and east of Hoh Lake, under the assumption that Bissert may have tried to follow one of the creeks downstream in hopes of finding a more visible trail or getting out of the park. By this point, there were about 30 people involved in the search, but their efforts were hampered by intermittent snowfall and winds which swept away any visible trails, including their own. Searches continued up for a week, using dogs, foot patrols, and helicopters, but after 7 days of searching turned up absolutely no new information, officials had to make the difficult decision to suspend the search. Park spokeswoman Kat Hoffman informed the press that the rangers believe Stefan got disoriented, injured, hypothermic, or a combination of all three while making his way across the ridge between the lakes. If Bissert hadn't wandered out of the park, then it was very unlikely that he was still alive considering the weather conditions and his lack of food or proper survival equipment, and a recovery effort would have to wait until the snows cleared in late spring. Now, this was a simple case of someone going into an area completely unprepared for what awaited him, losing his way, and then suffering the consequences. So you may be asking, why did I include it in this video? Well, it's because I found it listed alongside two other disappearances within the same immediate area, both of which share characteristics of Bissert's story, and yet make absolutely no sense whatsoever. But you know what does make sense? Protecting your online privacy. And that's why we've spent the last couple of years working with one of our favorite sponsors, Delete Me. While the internet age has made a lot of things more convenient than ever, it's also become much more difficult to keep your private information private. Anytime you sign up for a free trial, fill out a survey, or even just post to your social media, there's a chance that the information you shared, like your name, phone number, and even your physical or email address, could end up for sale by a shadowy cabal of miscreants known as data brokers. So, while it's certainly convenient to let the algorithm serve you the kind of content you want to see, events that are local to you, and ads that you might find relevant, the fact is that the same data that platforms use to show you all of those things can also be bought and sold. And that's where Delete Me comes in. It's a subscription data management service which finds the data you want kept private and files takedown notices on your behalf. You give them the information you want taken offline, and then their team handles the rest, no matter how many times your data pops up again. With over 100 million pieces of data removed for their customers, Delete Me has a proven track record of getting the job done. And that's why we continue to work with them as a brand sponsor year after year. If you're ready to take control of your digital footprint, head to joindeleteme.com/lorelodge or click the link in the description to get started with a 20% discount using code LORELODGE. Again, that is joindeleteme.com/lorelodge or click the link in the description and get started with a 20% discount using code LORELODGE. On December 24th, 2014, friends of Port Angeles, Washington resident James Griffin were expecting him to join them for a Christmas Eve dinner. It would have been one thing if he was a bit late, things happen, but James wasn't just running behind. In fact, by 10 o'clock p.m., he still hadn't shown up, he wasn't answering his phone, he wasn't at home, and when everyone really sat down to think about it, they realized that none of them had heard from or seen him in at least a couple of days. But what some of them did recall was a conversation from a few days earlier, in which James had mentioned that he was planning to go for a hike in Olympic National Park on Monday the 22nd. And on the other hand, he said he was going to be on one of his favorite routes, the Olympic Hot Springs Trail, which is a short out-and-back hike covering less than 6 miles, with only 300 feet of elevation gain. It would be hard to imagine somebody getting lost on a trail like that, especially someone as familiar with that particular trail as James was, but it was better to be safe than sorry, so they called the authorities to report him missing. Unfortunately, there was not much information to be found about the first day or two of searches. According to the Peninsula Daily News from Monday, December 29th, searches were conducted daily since Wednesday night, when he was first reported missing, though they weren't large scale. Still, rangers quickly located Griffin's blue Subaru Forester parked at the trailhead, and at some point during the search process, hikers who had been on the trail that day informed the rangers that they'd seen Griffin getting out of one of the warm pools at the hot springs around 4 in the afternoon on the 22nd. But that was all anyone seemed to know. His clothes had been sitting in a pile near the pool, so nobody even really knew what he was wearing. All they knew was that James had likely been hiking out in the dark, and that he'd gone missing on his way out. But beyond that, they were just as in the dark as he had been, if not more so. Their only real clue came with the discovery of James's backpack, which turned up about 50 feet north of the trail and just a half a mile from the trailhead, something which really only confused the matter further. From that point on, hikers only need to cross Cougar Creek and then follow a flat, if slightly winding section of trail back to the parking lot. But that wasn't the only odd thing about the scene. The backpack was found leaning against a log with a towel draped over it, and just a few feet away, sitting on another log, were a Coke can and a plastic coffee mug. Nearby was a pouch of freeze-dried food with water already in it, which had been resealed and apparently not finished. Inside James's pack, they found his camera, a photo of a nearby waterfall from earlier that year, some batteries believed to be for a headlamp, and 1 or 2 camp stoves. Even more intriguing, there were no signs of a struggle, and no evidence that animals had been prowling the area. From where the rangers stood, it looked as though James had sat down for a meal, eaten some of it, and then just vanished into thin air. Searchers tried to make sense of all of this, but again, after a full week of patrolling the trails, using dog teams to try and track his movement from the area where his supplies were found, and even performing grid searches spreading out 500 feet in every direction through this heavily forested area surrounding his gear, there was simply no sign of the missing retiree. Speaking to the Peninsula Daily News on December 29th, park spokesman Jassily Ray said that the scenario was unusual because people who reach a point so close to their vehicle are usually eager to get to it and get home, and do not stop for a meal in the dark. Now, it was possible that an old leg injury reported by James's family kept him moving slow, or that he just stopped to rest, but that didn't explain the fact that he'd suddenly left all of his supplies and a half-eaten meal behind, and then wandered off in the wrong direction on a trail he knew like the back of his hand. And that's not just my opinion on this case. According to Ranger Sanny Lustig, the lead ranger in the search effort, this one is really a puzzler, and it would only grow more puzzling a month later when another discovery deepened the mystery even further. Almost exactly a month to the day after James was reported missing, a volunteer search party took advantage of unseasonably warm, dry weather to bring cadaver dogs out to the site. And one of those teams located Griffin's body on January 25th, 2015, just not where anyone would have expected him to be. You see, cadaver dogs work differently from tracking dogs. Where the latter tries to pick up the scent of a specific individual, the former is trained to smell decay, and they can smell it from a long way off. In this case, 3/4 of a mile and over 1,000 feet in elevation higher than where the initial search took place. And while I could find no details about the condition of James's body, it's likely that the cold weather kept it reasonably well preserved, which should have revealed any signs of significant distress. When authorities arrived to inspect the scene, they found no evidence of a struggle, and no obvious cause of death, leading them to the tentative conclusion that Griffin most likely died of exposure after becoming disoriented in the dark, wet, and cold on December 22nd. 2 months later, on March 22nd, the Clallam County Coroner's Office came forward with the autopsy report confirming that assessment, but not everybody was satisfied with the conclusion. Robert L. Griffin still has questions surrounding the death of his younger brother, reported the Peninsula Daily News. It is really odd, the elder Griffin brother told the paper over the phone, though he seemed to accept that it's just one of those things that happened, and nobody will ever know what the reasons were for him going up that hill. The Peninsula Daily News had reported in early February that why James Thomas Griffin set off at nightfall in the cold rain up a steep, densely forested slope on a deadly hike remains a mystery, and the release of the autopsy hadn't changed that. There were still no signs of a struggle, no internal or external trauma, and no controlled substances that would result in any hallucinogenic high or experience. And the authorities concluded that it appears Griffin's death was unplanned and that it occurred without intent. And though he was grateful for the closure, Robert had the same questions that anyone looking at James's disappearance would. Chief among them, why did he do that? The Rangers had initially suggested that he might have suffered a medical event, such as a stroke, but if the autopsy found any evidence of such a thing, it didn't make it to the press. Now, hypothermia is a reasonable conclusion for how he died, but without something to indicate a medical issue, the autopsy didn't do anything to explain the glaring issue of why he left his gear behind in the first place. So far as I can tell, there was no evidence that Griffin had any mental health issues. In fact, the Peninsula Daily News reporting from December 28th argued precisely the opposite. There have been stories of people who wandered off into the woods to die on their own terms, but authorities also concluded that his death did not seem like it was intentional, self-inflicted, or otherwise. If it wasn't a medical issue, and it wasn't intentional, then why did he seemingly randomly seal up his food, get up, and then walk 1,000 feet uphill? Rangers suggested that he'd become lost, but that doesn't really make much sense either, unless he'd become disoriented first. Now, hypothermia can do that, but usually not at the stage where you can still walk up a steep hill for 1/3 of a mile. And in order to get that cold, he would need to have decided to not use either of the stoves he had to start a campfire. One could argue that he was hypothermic by the time he stopped to rest and was too out of sorts to even think about building a fire, but considering that he must have used one of the stoves to boil water to rehydrate his meal, it seems unlikely that his faculties were inhibited enough to forego that opportunity. The only part of the narrative that I think doesn't have serious issues is his decision to stop and eat a meal. He had a leg injury which slowed him down, and if he felt like he needed to rest before tackling the last stretch of trail, it would have made sense to use that time to eat. It wasn't going to be any more comfortable at the trailhead, and if he was feeling weak or cold, then the food might be just what he needed to get through that last half mile. I've been in a similar situation myself, so I would totally understand that thought process. What I don't understand is the evidence suggesting that he ate a few bites, sealed up the packaging, and then was suddenly struck by such a strong sense of disorientation that he scrambled up a 33-degree slope in the dark, when the only thing he would certainly have known is that the parking lot and the trail could not possibly be that far up the hill. I really think the whole thing can be summed up with the question, how do you get lost while sitting still? This story would be believable if his pack was found with his body. It would be believable if the area was flat. It would be believable if he was on an unfamiliar trail. It would be believable if he was somewhere miles away from his destination. It simply is not believable, however, that he got up, walked away from his gear for no reason, and then wandered off in the one direction where he definitely wouldn't be able to find the trail. It just doesn't make sense. And neither did the disappearance of Jacob Gray 2.5 years later. On the afternoon of April 6, 2017, a woman was driving down Solduck Road on her way out of Olympic National Park when she spied something strange off the side of the highway. At first glance, it appeared to be a jumble of red, yellow, and gray materials, about 10 yards into the trees beyond the roadside, with the riverbank another 20 yards beyond that. But upon further investigation, she recognized it to be a bike and a trailer, and she recalled seeing a young man pedaling one just like it up the same road earlier that day. Now, this was an odd place to leave a bike, but there was no sign that something was wrong, so she continued on her way without much of a second thought. Now, sometime that same day, Ranger John Bowie found himself at the scene, observing the site with a degree of confusion. It was indeed a bike and trailer, but that in and of itself wasn't what struck him as odd. Instead, he was perplexed by the fact that it seemed to have been there all day, and yet the owner was nowhere to be seen. As far as you could tell, the tires all looked fine, the bike appeared to be in working order, and there was no sign of distress in the area. The only thing that stuck out as unusual, aside from the location and the lack of an owner, was the sight of 4 arrows stuck into the ground in an east-west line. And Bowie was unsure of what that meant, if anything at all. And since nobody had been reported missing, and it was very possible that the owner was just off on a hike nearby, Bowie made a note of it and called Ranger Brian Ray to request that he come check it out the next morning. And then he headed off on the rest of his patrol route. When Ray arrived the next morning, the bike was still there, and more importantly, it seemed to be completely untouched. The whole scene stood exactly as it had when Bowie came across it the day before, and that meant they might have a problem on their hands. Now, it is extremely rare that a ranger is the one who reports a tourist missing, but after a brief search of the area and a call up to Solduck Hot Springs Resort revealed nothing about the absent cyclist, that is precisely what they did. Whoever had been riding the bike appeared to have been organizing his gear before he wandered off, since a tarp was laid out on the ground and there was camping equipment all over the place, and amongst the various items and belongings, Ranger Ray was able to find the first clue as to who they were looking for. It was a list of phone numbers, and one of those phone numbers belonged to a Mallory Gray. The ranger dialed the number and soon found himself speaking with the 23-year-old sister of his missing biker, 22-year-old Port Townsend resident Jacob Gray. Mallory Gray quickly directed Ray to call her parents in Santa Cruz, California, and it wasn't long before they managed to get in touch with Randy Gray, Jacob's father, who didn't need to hear much before he and his wetsuit were loaded into his truck, and after a stop to pick up Mallory, he began the 1,000-mile journey north to go looking for his son. Elsewhere in Santa Cruz, Jacob's mother Laura was on the phone with the Olympic Rangers, telling them everything she knew about why Jacob was in the park and what his plans were. As far as she knew, her younger son was just starting out on a cross-country bike trip with the intention of visiting his older brother Micah, a U.S. Coast Guardsman stationed in Vermont. It was an ambitious trip, but Jacob apparently planned on taking his time with it, up to 2 years on the long end, and he figured he could just pick up jobs to pay for basic expenses as he went. But none of that explained why he'd parked his bike and trailer off the side of the road, what those 4 arrows meant, or where he could have gone. The only other clue was a verse circled in the Holman Christian Standard Version Bible found amongst his belongings, Isaiah 34:14. That passage reads, "And an abode of ostriches, and the desert creatures shall meet with the wolves. The hairy goat shall also cry to its kind. Yes, the night monster shall settle there." But Randy Gray wasn't about to let the lack of direction stop him from looking, and he wasted no time in driving north. He and Mallory made the entire trip in one nonstop dash, arriving in the park on Tuesday, April 11th. And that is the point in the story where I stopped for a second and then reread everything I had found so far. Because April 11th? Ranger Ray found the phone number on the 7th, and according to John Billman at Bicycling Magazine, who I have to give all of the credit for this segment of the video, basically everything here, with the exception of stuff I'm citing directly from papers, came from his coverage, his interviews, things like that. Absolutely phenomenal article by John Billman over at Bicycling. But as soon as Ray called Randy, according to John, Jacob's father and sister were on their way north. Now, it is a 15 to 20 hour drive from Santa Cruz to Port Townsend, depending on which route you travel, so they should have arrived on the 8th or early on the 9th at the very latest. Even if we account for Randy taking some time to sleep before heading out, he should have been in the park by the 10th. So, did Ranger Ray wait a day to make this phone call? If he did, it wouldn't be the only bizarre choice by the Rangers involved in this case. When the family finally made their way into the park, they were surprised to find that no Ranger-assisted search had been launched. And that in and of itself is completely out of the ordinary so far as all the missing person cases I've looked at go. Usually it's the Rangers who are the first ones in and the last ones out in these sorts of cases, with the exception of family and friends who may stay on after official efforts are suspended. When Stephen Bissert disappeared in 1992, when James Griffin went missing in 2014, and on essentially every other occasion I looked into in the Olympics, the Rangers were quick to call in every resource they could. In this case, however, they had totally failed to contact Olympic Mountain Rescue, the Clallam County Sheriff's Office, or the Coast Guard base in Port Angeles. It took some badgering from the Grays and from Laura's family, but the Park Service finally did request the assistance of Olympic Mountain Rescue on Wednesday, April 12th. By that time, Jacob had already been missing for 6 days, and chances of finding him alive were slim. With that in mind, they looked to the water. Randy and his ex-wife's cousin, Danny Campbell, had already started searching the river the day before, mostly checking inside and beneath log jams as they worked their way down 12 miles of river. When Olympic Mountain Rescue's teams arrived on the 12th, they quickly located evidence that someone had swapped hiking boots for running shoes, walked to the river's edge, slipped and fell in, leaving a mark on a mossy rock, and downstream 30 yards or so, there were signs that someone may have scrambled out. But that probably wasn't Jacob, not only because it appeared somebody had scrambled out, but also because he wouldn't have been wearing hiking shoes while riding his bike. Still, the river was the most likely place for Jacob to be, and unfortunately, they had no means of checking anything else. In what I must stress is an incredibly unusual situation, the Park Service almost seemed to be dragging its feet on looking for Jacob. They had promised a dog team on the 12th, but that day came and went without any canines reaching the search area. An external volunteer team arrived on the 13th with cadaver dogs, but even after they hit on a logjam, nothing came of it. If it was Jacob they smelled, then he was either further upstream, or he drifted further downriver after getting stuck there. It was possible that he was further upstream, of course, as searchers did find weak old footprints in the roots of a tree that had fallen partially across the river, which went towards the west bank, but park officials said that there was no evidence that whoever left them came up the west bank. Now, perhaps the most egregious example of the Park Service's failures in this case came when the Coast Guard, eager to assist the family of a service member, Jacob's older brother Micah, offered the use of one of their helicopters and its crew out of the Port Angeles base. Now, it would have taken them just 5 minutes to fly the 25 miles to the search area, and when it comes to aerial searches, the Coast Guard is second to none. Yet for utterly inexplicable reasons, the National Park Service at Olympic National Park rejected their assistance. The National Forest Service was not so unwilling to accept help, however, and welcomed Clallam County Search and Rescue into their jurisdiction on the western side of the Solduck River on the 15th. Still, the bulk of the search was on the National Park side, and it was woefully inadequate. The well-trained and experienced rangers either lacked the resources or the drive to properly conduct the effort, leaving it mostly to Olympic Mountain Rescue and the family, all the while discouraging more volunteers who might come in from the surrounding area. To be completely fair, that has become standard practice because in the past, large volunteer searches have made it difficult for trackers to trace footprints, dogs to pick up scents, and sometimes they even trample evidence. But by this point in the search, they had no prints, scents, or otherwise to contaminate. By the time the Rangers suspended the official search, what little of it ever existed on the 17th, all that anyone was able to do was rule out possibilities. Jacob almost certainly wasn't in the river, and if he was, then he'd floated remarkably far downstream without getting caught on anything or being noticed. Nobody could recall seeing the 5'11" tall, good-looking young man on any of the nearby trails or roads, nor could anyone in Port Angeles, Forks, or any of the towns in between. He might have hiked into the mountains and met his fate there, but there was no reason to think he had. At least, none that didn't come with a slew of other questions. After all the time he put into prepping for the bike journey, why would Jacob abandon his bike, asks John Billman, who spent time searching with Randy Gray in the summer of 2017. And why wouldn't he contact his family? He'd done that last time he made an impulsive decision to go somewhere unexpected, when he decided to go for a light stroll from, Santa Cruz to San Francisco. And along the way, he had called Mallory to tell her that he was hungry, and she'd driven out to bring him food and water. But this time, he'd left his phone behind at his grandmother's house in Port Townsend. Why? Well, there were some concerns about his mental health. According to Randy, Jacob hadn't been himself since the divorce, while his mother said he was struggling with the transition to adulthood. He'd yet to nail down a firm job and had spent the prior month living with his grandmother in order to try and find a change of pace. This cross-country bike trip was supposed to be just that, but now it seemed as though he'd abandoned that plan altogether the moment he rode off towards the Olympics. And he certainly did when he decided to leave his bike behind. If he wanted to disappear, to start his life over somewhere else, or even just get away from all the things which caused him distress, he could very easily have made his way to Canada or to Mexico, or even just hit the road as a migrant worker. So why start here, on some random stretch of road in a national park, and why leave everything behind? Most importantly, where had he gone? Everyone had their guesses, but absolutely nobody could have predicted the answer, least of all the people who actually found him. On August 10th, 2018, nearly a year and a half after he'd abandoned his bike and wandered into the wilderness, a team of biologists who made the trip into the mountains to study marmots stumbled upon what appeared to be human remains. High up on a ridge overlooking a lake and well off the trail, they found portions of a human skeleton, and along with them, insulated clothing, some hiking gear, a cigarette lighter, another Bible, plenty of food, and a wallet. It was Jacob, and with that, one piece of the mystery was solved, but in a manner that deepened the uncertainty about every other aspect of his death. You see, Jacob's remains weren't found downriver of where he'd abandoned his bike. They weren't found somewhere along Solduck Road or in one of the many drainages leading down to the river of the same name either. No, they were found at Hoh Lake, 15 miles from Jacob's last known location, and nearly 4,000 feet higher in elevation. While this did put the question of where he'd gone to rest, it also threw everything else into chaos. Now, it wasn't that Hoh Lake was inaccessible. It's along the same trail where Stefan Bissert disappeared 25 years earlier, and the trailhead is at the end of Solduck Road. It wouldn't even be an odd place for Jacob to put on his itinerary, outside of the fact that he was supposed to be heading east and not down a dead-end road into the mountains. There are definitely a number of questions, but the one that sticks out to me the most is, why did he leave his bike where he did? Just about everything else has an explanation, even if it's a flimsy one. A self-inflicted death was totally off the table as far as Mallory was concerned, but some family members suggested he might have been trying to get closer to God. Mallory in particular told John Billman that Jacob was really lost, and he didn't know what he wanted to do in life, where he wanted to go, what he wanted to be. The state of the world had gotten him down, she said, and he sought answers in the Bible. The verse circled in the Bible found back at camp, Isaiah 34:14, speaks of the wilderness, but in the greater context about the judgment of the nations and of Edom in particular. Maybe his goal was to go and reflect on the world, pray, and ask God for direction before making his next step. But even if that was the case, why leave everything behind where he did? It's not like he left the bike at the trailhead. He was still miles away, and it's not like walking there would have been any easier. He might have hitchhiked, but unless he wasn't planning to come down, that would have left him in a precarious situation should he be unable to find a ride back to where he left everything. Then there's the issue of how he actually died. The coroner ruled his cause of death to be inconclusive, and reports leaned toward hypothermia, but much like in the case of James Griffin, that doesn't explain how he ended up hypothermic in the first place. Jacob wasn't inexperienced in the outdoors. He was dressed properly, he had a lighter, plenty of food, and he was in very good shape. Most importantly, he was found at the top of the ridge, and news reports citing Randy Gray as a source claimed that his clothes were found scattered along the ridge. And then those same articles imply that Jacob was taking things off as he walked due to paradoxical undressing, which is where somebody who is going through hypothermia starts to take clothes off because they feel really warm. The issue with that explanation is that paradoxical undressing represents the last effort of the victim and is followed almost immediately by unconsciousness and death. So, in order for Jacob to have reached that point, he would need to have allowed himself to reach end-stage hypothermia without even attempting to make it to lower, warmer ground. He simply knew better than that. Why he left nearly all of his gear behind nearly 8 miles from the trailhead, and how he succumbed to hypothermia while wearing insulated clothes and carrying the means to build a fire aren't the only remaining questions, though. Why, against all policy and in direct contradiction to the norm, did the Olympic Park Rangers fail at every step of the way? Why didn't they begin a search when they first discovered Jacob's gear? It wasn't a place that made sense for someone to stop. He hadn't set up a campsite. Everything sat there undisturbed for an entire day, and Ranger Bowie still decided to wait until the following morning to begin any sort of investigation. It's even worse that they called the family, identified the gear as belonging to Jacob, were told that his family considered him to be missing, and yet still waited until they actually arrived in the park to begin any search effort. Then, when they finally did begin looking, they basically just poked around the scene for a bit without bothering to call in rescue resources. All logic led to the sole duck, Billman writes of the Ranger's thought process. Jacob needed water, he skipped to the river to filter into his camelback, he slipped and fell in, the water sweeping him downriver. That's the likely scenario, concluded the Olympic Park Rangers. We think he fell into the river, we'll check the river in the summer when the water goes down. Under absolutely no circumstances is that an acceptable way of handling a missing persons case, and it's completely out of character for the Park Service. According to Billman, Jacob's family wonders if he could have been found alive if officials had gotten a helicopter in the air and dogs into the backcountry within a day or so of finding the bike. And the answer is that they very well might have. If scent tracking dogs were brought in on the 6th or even the 7th, they might well have led searchers away from the river and thus changed the entire trajectory of the search. Instead, they held off on the dogs until a full week had passed, and even then the Greys once again had to force the issue. By that time, the scent trackers were off the table, and cadaver dogs just don't work the same way. Even if the trackers had failed, there's also the fact that Jacob's remains were found above the tree line. Unless he reached that point on the 6th and then died the same night, a rescue crew in a helicopter, such as the one offered by the Coast Guard, would have stood a very good chance of finding him alive before it was too late. If you thought the weird behavior would stop there, you'd be wrong. Rangers reportedly found the bike on the 6th, but they didn't notify the media until the 11th. If the Greys hadn't shown up to look, would they have mentioned it at all? And maybe if the evening papers were emblazoned with headlines reading "Cyclist Believed Missing in Olympics," someone who saw Jacob that day would have come forward to say they spotted him on the Sole Duck Trail, and the search might have ended up looking in the right place. Why choose not to mention it, and why wait until long after it had become clear that Jacob was missing to say anything at all? And then there's the discrepancies. The Peninsula Daily News reported on April 27, 2017, that Randy's ex-wife called him on April 9th to let him know his son was missing, and Rangers had said the river conditions were too bad to do a full search. Something Randy himself found to be untrue when he arrived and started doing precisely that. The bigger problem with the report, however, is that Billman, who spoke to the family, volunteer searchers, and several park rangers, clearly states that it was the Rangers who told Randy about Jacob's disappearance. He also says that Randy began to make his way up to the Olympics the moment he heard about what happened, and that he drove straight through the night, only stopping for gas. So either Billman got it wrong, or the Rangers didn't bother calling the family until 2 days after they found Mallory's number. It's hard to believe that they found the number on the 7th, called Laura that same day, and that she waited 2 days to tell Randy. It's especially hard to believe that they called Mallory first, and that she then waited 2 days to tell her father. Was this just an atrocious case of the Park Service dropping the ball, or was there some other reason they avoided launching any semblance of a legitimate search effort? All of that said, there is at least one explanation that I do think is somewhat plausible regarding why Jacob disappeared and how he died. According to Billman, Mallory talked with Randy about the possibility of cults or human trafficking. Now, is it possible that somebody misled him about a trail, feigned needing help, or otherwise tricked him into a vulnerable position, only to abduct him? Sure, but I'm more interested in the cult angle. Human traffickers don't typically abduct well-built young men and then carry them up a mountainside, only to leave them to die of exposure. Given some of the religious stuff, on the other hand, and the fact that Jacob was from California, I don't think the other possibility is so far-fetched. Just as a disclaimer, I am a Christian. I was a Methodist for many years, and I recently became a member of the Anglican Catholic Church, to be specific. So I don't mean to suggest that religious people are susceptible to joining cults. Instead, I'm looking at the specific kinds of verses Jacob was circling. Verses about the wrath of God and his judgment against wicked nations, and his general mental health situation. According to his own family, Jacob felt lost, without direction, and his parents' divorce had turned his life upside down at a critical time in his development. He was 18 when they split up, and 4 years later his life still lacked structure. Could he have gone looking for answers and found some less than honest group offering them? It doesn't seem like anyone checked through his internet history or chat logs. What if he fell into the wrong kind of online community and ended up convinced that he needed to go on some sort of vision quest? Why did he take a Bible up the mountain with him? If he'd planned on staying the night, that wouldn't be unusual, but so far as I can tell, he left all of his camping gear behind with the trailer. So might this have been some sort of initiation ritual? some sort of cult mission? It's impossible to say, given what we know about Jacob's disappearance and who he was as a person. I struggle to understand the decisions he made if they weren't driven by some sort of conviction that he was supposed to reach the top of that mountain and stay there for some period of time. On the other hand, there's not really any evidence to go on beyond deductive reasoning. He must have made it to that ridge somehow, and there's probably someone out there who recalls seeing a young man matching his description walking along the road or trail somewhere along that 15-mile route between where he left his bike and where his remains were found. It's been 8 long years since Jacob disappeared, 7 since his remains were recovered. It's obviously too late to save him, but if the Park Service would go ahead and release information about the clothes found with his body and put out a call for information, it may not be too late to learn what happened. Of course, if the family would prefer that this all be put to rest for good, then those wishes should be respected, absent any concrete evidence that Jacob had fallen in with a cult. For my part, I just can't wrap my head around one particular question, which is shared between Jacob Gray and James Griffin. Why did both of them seemingly stop what they were doing, leave their gear behind, and walk up into the mountains? Their bodies were found less than 9 miles apart. Their last known locations weren't much further from one another. Both of these men were adults and experienced trail hikers, and yet both of them deliberately left the trail and traveled uphill when they knew that going downhill would lead them to a road. Why? Hypothermic delusions don't make sense in either situation because both men possess the ability to start a fire, and in Griffin's case, he'd actually just used a camp stove to heat water for his meal. So why is it that these two men, who certainly knew what they should have been doing, ignored all instinct, training, and wisdom, and instead just walked off into oblivion? It's impossible to say for certain. Maybe the official narrative is right. Maybe these were just two bizarre instances which just so happened to occur less than 10 miles apart in only 3 years. Maybe I'm just overthinking it. But the one thing that we can definitely take away from these two stories is this. Stay on the trail, definitely don't leave your supplies behind, and avoid solo hiking if at all possible. Stories of missing individuals are unfortunately all too common, but stories of missing pairs are almost unheard of. If Jacob and James hadn't gone out alone, and I just realized that they were both JG in their initials, too many coincidences, jeez, both would probably have walked out of those mountains alive. As for Stefan, Gerd probably would have died right alongside him if he'd attempted to accompany him. Don't try to hike 20 miles with nothing but a light sweater and a few pieces of fruit, guys. I don't mean to speak ill of the dead, but that's just a profoundly stupid thing to do. It's not tough, it's not impressive, it's just reckless, and it's likely to get you killed. Now, with all of that said, I have no idea on this one. It seems like too many coincidences to be coincidence, but at the same time, there's really no evidence to suggest foul play. There's nothing supernatural in appearance here. This is, as I said in other videos, along the route that, Big Feet supposedly travel, according to the, Sasquatch, more appropriately, according to the Klamath, and the Klallam, sorry, not the Klamath, the Klallam. But the problem there is that, and I feel abundantly silly saying this, it's the wrong time of the year for the Sasquatch migration. Gonna be totally real with you guys. I never expected to know nearly as much about Sasquatch as I do. Totally not on my bingo card. If you told 16-year-old me you're gonna know more about Sasquatch than most people, I would have asked you how my life was gonna go wrong. Although if certain things about this platform don't turn around soon, I might just have to go full Squatch hunter because weird little transition here. I don't have much else to say about today's stories. For those who aren't aware, I recently discovered that for at least several months now, I think going back to May 2025, a completely AI-generated channel has been using my voice, they cloned my voice, has been using my voice to pump out absolute slop. Just true crime slop that is clearly trained using my scripts, but also pulling from Reddit and other places and infesting the videos with all sorts of misinformation, using awful clickbait, just saying terrible, terrible things about people. And the most offensive one was Gabby Petito, because I actually worked with and spoke with her family throughout my coverage of that case. And then when the time came that the Netflix documentary came out and all that, The reason that there wasn't a follow-up, the reason I didn't cover the Netflix documentary, the reason that we didn't have Nicole or TJ on the show is because they said that they just wanted to finally have a chance to mourn. And so I said, would you prefer that we just drop it and don't talk about it anymore? And she basically said yes. You know, and that's how it should be. If somebody says we're done, they're done. It's not my story. Gabby's story is not my story to tell without permission. And that may sound a little odd because I cover a lot of stories without the family's permission, but when it's something where the family has explicitly said we don't want this being covered anymore, we just want to grieve, it's time to stop. So that was probably the most offensive thing about this channel, but yeah, it had cloned my voice, so it's my voice saying all of these horrible, misinformed things. It even had my inflection, it had my vocabulary, it was very strange. Now, thankfully, we have an utterly incredible community here who immediately after I found this out and I asked people if they could go and comment on that channel's videos to let people know that it was an AI clone of the Lore Lodge that was masquerading as being an actual person doing research and making videos when in reality they were just stealing my content and my identity at the same time. The channel was nuked within 24 hours, within 12 hours from what I can tell. I went to look at it 12 hours after sending out those messages, and it wasn't gone, but all of the videos were set to private. All of the branding had been changed. I also threatened legal action, so that probably helped too. But you guys were phenomenal. You really stood up when you needed to, and you helped us in a way that I really do appreciate so much. You know, you guys are the reason that we get to do this job, that we get to live our dream, that I get to research all of these different things week in and week out. And we are really just so incredibly grateful for that. And unfortunately, the platform has not been particularly helpful. They're still asking me to explain the copyright strike I filed against a channel that was literally using my voice without my permission. And I keep getting automated responses. It's actually ironic when you think about it. All we ask is you join us in the fight against AI, and it seems like you guys are really stepping up, and we really appreciate that so much. You are phenomenal. You are the reason we get to do what we do, and we really do appreciate you. Now, if you have the ability to and you would like to support us in a more direct manner, we do have Patreon. It's just $1 a month, and starting sometime in October, these videos, including a backlog, but definitely all the videos going forward, the backlog will take longer. All of the videos going forward from October, you'll be able to catch ad-free on Patreon. $1 a month, no ads, no sponsored segments, just the video, that's it. We've also begun uploading these videos to Spotify, so you can catch them there. You can catch our podcast, The Lore Lads, here on YouTube on Wednesday nights at 7, or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever, the Wednesday after they air. And again, those shows are Monday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern, unless they're not, and if they're not, we'll tell you. But the more important detail there is Patreon, $1 a month, ad-free, starting in October. You can also get our coffee, Mount Pocono Perk, from Tableau Roasting Company. I designed it myself. It is a delicious medium blend that is meant to be sophisticated enough to drink black, but mild enough if you prefer cream and sugar. I wanted it that way. I gave the specific kinds of beans, even some specific temperatures, to Matt Moore, and he ran with it, and I drink that coffee every day of my life. I love it, and I am a coffee snob. You can also wear the Lodge by going to bunkerbranding.com and going to the Lore Lodge section, and of course, all of these links are down in the description. Speaking of links that are in the description, there is our Discord server, which you can also get to by going to bit.ly/jointhelodge. That's where all of the announcements, some community stuff, all of that goes on. That is the best place to keep in touch and keep on track of what we're doing here at the Lodge. And of course, we do have our other channels. I actually just recorded the first episode of a brand new show called My Apologies for the Weird Bible channel, where I will be interviewing apologists from various sects of Christianity. We're going to be launching a show called The Nicene Crowd over there as well. And then, of course, there's the Weird Bible podcast itself, which whenever Wendigoon gets a chance, we will add more Weird Bible podcast episodes, but he's a very busy man, so unfortunately we haven't been able to be consistent about that. Now, our newest, the flagship of non-Lore Lodge channels is History Unhinged. We do that with Stephen Bell from History of Everything and Stakuyi. It is my favorite show that we do. It is a lot of fun. It's just Stephen and I sitting there talking about history like guys being dudes. We're not sitting there giving you a lecture. Aiden's there kind of to guide the conversation and to have input when he does. It is a lot of fun. It is equal parts comedy and history, and I absolutely love doing it. So if you want to check that out, it is over on the channel History Unhinged. Highly recommend it. And there's a Patreon for that too. Okay, I think that's been a very long outro, but I do also think I'd covered everything. Once again, John Billman's article on the Jacob Gray situation, utterly phenomenal work, full of information, direct from the sources. Cannot recommend it enough. If you're interested in that case, go and read his article on it. And then also, thank you again to Delete Me for sponsoring this video and so many of our others. With all that said, I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.